welcome to the Three Theology Questions podcast. I'm Josh Binner. Thank you so much for joining me today. On this episode, we talk about Christianity and film. Films can have such a powerful impact in the themes that they cover. Even popular movies can include credible gospel themes and messages of redemption, messages of hope, battles of good and evil. And as Christians, I think that there are a number of films that can be truly edifying to us in really depicting the gospel. A popular example for me, one of my favorite movies, is The Little Mermaid, classic Disney movie from 1993. And to me, The Little Mermaid is telling the story of the gospel. You have Ariel, she's got it all. She's a princess. She's the king's daughter. She's beautiful. She has a beautiful singing voice. Yet, she's dissatisfied. She has this existential crisis. She wants to be part of another world. The earth, the land, is where she thinks life is really at. And I think the land in that movie represents heaven. Now, to get to the land, Ariel's rebellious. She doesn't listen to her father, and she ultimately makes a deal with basically a demonic figure in the movie, Ursula the Sea Witch. She essentially sells her soul to the devil. Now, when Ariel loses out on the agreement that she made with Ursula, how is she saved? Ultimately through her loving father, who I think represents Christ in the movie. And it's so striking that if you remember in The Little Mermaid, Ariel becomes this like little seaweed, sea urchin creature, and her father trades places with her. He takes the punishment, he gives his life for hers, and to me, a profound moment in the movie is you see his crown literally fall to the bottom of the sea. That's what he gives to save Ariel. That's the story of the gospel. We are sinful people, and it is Jesus who lived the perfect life that we could not live, went to the cross, and took the penalty of our sins for us. That's a movie about the gospel. But there's all sorts of popular movies where we see these great gospel themes. And so I'm so excited to be joined today by our guest, Josh Shepard, to talk about faith and film. Josh is a writer who covers culture, faith, and public policy for several media outlets, including The Federalist and The Stream. His writing has also appeared in publications such as The Daily Signal, The Christian Post, Providence Magazine, Christian Headlines. Josh is a graduate of the University of Colorado. He's also previously worked for the Heritage Foundation and Focus on the Family. Josh lives in the Washington, D.C. area. Josh, it is so good to have you with me. I sincerely thank you for taking the time to talk to me this morning.
My great pleasure, Josh, and it's great to talk to another Josh. Now, it's great to talk to just anyone about storytelling, about culture. I think it's going to be a great, fun conversation, and thrilled to just have a good dialogue about it.
I appreciate that. And I did at one point joke about only having guests also named Josh on the podcast. I think there's enough of us to where that could by itself we could call it the Josh cast, and that could just fill an entire fascinating array of topics.
It's really true. You know, when I was in college at Oral Roberts University initially, I graduated from University of Colorado, but when I lived on campus at ORU in Tulsa, I had a floor. I was on the 12th floor of this dorm room, and there were 3 other Joshes on the same floor. So there were 4 of us. It was pretty ridiculous. So, you know, I just became known as Shepherd, and that's, I guess everybody just kind of, tries to differentiate us. But it is a great name. It's a strong name. I'm thankful for it, despite, I know it's maybe common in our generation. So
I appreciate that. And yes, I think it's the best name, but I'm a little bit biased. But where I'd like to begin today is asking, as somebody who obviously pays a lot of attention to film and movie and what's on the different streaming services, I'd be curious for 2021, what are some of the things that you're excited about that are coming out?
Well, it's interesting because I published a list back in early 2020 in February with the Federalist about 20 things I was looking forward to in 2020. And frankly, about probably 6 or 8 of those have still not released. So there is a significant backlog of 2020 releases that now we're going to get to enjoy, I think, in 2021. So There's several. I think. I mean, I could go by different streaming services, like a number of things. I think certainly my coverage is very focused on Disney. I think it's a very exciting year for Disney and Disney Plus. It's almost like 2020 was almost sort of the soft launch of Disney Plus, and now 2021 they're actually going to, I think, kind of fulfill the promises that they made with that service. Shows like WandaVision and Loki and Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I think those sort of superhero shows, they do have a lot to say about good and evil, about the conflict of worldviews, and some bigger ideas that are not just kind of a sort of shoot 'em up thing. And I think somebody who personally enjoys genres like fantasy and sci-fi and kind of speculative fiction, I think all those are going to give some interesting twists on kind of the Marvel equation of the MCU stuff that we've been seeing, that maybe follows a certain mold. And I think all of those are going to be in a little bit different mold. But for turning to another service, I think even films. So for instance, HBO Max, I think I might be getting at least a small short trial of it. I haven't really gotten onto it too much, but there's a film called The Little Things that is from one of my favorite directors, John Lee Hancock. John Lee Hancock had done the Highwaymen on Netflix. He's done Disney's Saving Mr. Banks. He did The Blind Side, which he won some Oscars for. Just a guy who tells a lot of stories about America, I feel like, and stuff that is very interesting. So this is more actually of a crime drama, The Little Things, that deals with Denzel Washington, I believe, is a cop in it, and it has a really kind of star-studded cast, and it takes place in New York City. So it looks like a great film. Probably, I would imagine, R-rated, but that's one that I would look forward to doing. I think it's a real different kind of feel for John Lee Hancock and what he's done in the past. So I'm looking forward to that. On the more faith-based side of things, there's a couple of shows people should all be watching, I hope. One is The Chosen. That Dallas Jenkins and the team have been doing phenomenal work. They did that in season 1. I think if there's any story to come out of the pandemic in terms of entertainment, one of the biggest ones is that The Chosen season 1 has just absolutely exploded in its viewership, and that's due to the great support of VidAngel, which is a faith-based streaming platform, and they created its own app for The Chosen and made it very easy for people to engage with that. And I think 180 nations plus have been engaged with that show, and so they've done season 1, I think was 8 episodes, and this second season is coming, I believe, on Easter. And I'm excited about that. I think those guys are doing, phenomenal work of adapting the gospel story, giving you a feel for the disciples and for the first century kind of Jewish culture and what they encountered there and the different factions that are there. It's almost like has some similarities, I think, to AD. The Bible Continues, that show that came out a few years back, and I really love what they're doing with it, and think this next season is going to really amp up, the drama and where they've gone. Have you got to see that, Josh?
I actually have not seen The Chosen.
Oh, that is shocking.
That was very popular.
Yeah, it's quite a good show, and it's free. I mean, you don't have to, it's not a difficult thing to get into. So definitely one to watch. The other Christian faith-based show I would mention is Vindication. So this is a small, low budget show out of Dallas, and they really made a good little splash with it this year as well. And so they've filmed season 2. I believe it's going to be out middle of the year or into the late spring. But it's actually a crime drama. Deals with a detective at the heart of it, and but it deals with both his personal and professional life. I think those guys have done some great writing and given us some great work, and so I'm eager to see where they go in season 2, because season 1 was definitely an early effort. So yeah, there's going to be a lot to enjoy, I think, in 2021 and appreciate. And I'm one who, those are not maybe the most big budget projects or ones that are out there in the mainstream so much, but those are the kind of things I'm looking at and watching for.
Yeah, that does sound exciting, and it makes sense what you said about stuff being backlogged. So, I mean, 2021 might be an even better entertainment year than this year has been.
Yeah, I think it will be. To mention a few others maybe from my list too, there's an Aretha Franklin biopic that's going to be coming out. So I think that's going to be excellent. I do think she's, the Queen of Soul. She's a fascinating figure, and one who grew up in church and became this amazing figure on the national and international stage. So I think that will be one to watch. Jennifer Hudson is playing her in that film, and there are certainly others, I'm sure, that are more ones to watch and be engaged with. And I know Netflix will probably get some, and Amazon will get some. It's just interesting how it's this very splintered world of streaming services right now.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That actually kind of leads into a second question that I was curious to ask you about, because there are so many streaming services that are out on the market right now. Certainly, with your writing on movies and film and entertainment, but also you write on in politics as well and live in DC, and certainly there's a lot of polarization in America right now. We see that in political beliefs, in moral beliefs, in the types of media people consume. And I'd be curious, as we do have this onslaught of options now with streaming services, do you see perhaps um, a greater proliferation of specifically made Christian content coming into the market? Obviously, Christian films aren't new; they've been around for a long time. But do you see that becoming more of a growing trend?
It's interesting. I think I would. It's definitely not a clear yes or no for me on that one. I think, for instance, we have seen just in the last 5 years, maybe 10 total, the kind of implosion of the Christian bookstore market. And that did create kind of a ready-made sort of way for Christian filmmakers and people who want to tell faith-based stories to very much get it to the marketplace of churches. So it's become much more difficult, and maybe a good thing. And it's kind of like the Christian music market, where that used to be its own little ecosystem, and its own little kind of, small, almost mirror of the larger world. And now, Christian artists are having to compete and to deal, to realize they're kind of have to have the same quality of the general marketplace. And we've seen that happen with Christian music, I think, over the last 10, 15 years. And now we're seeing it happen with the Christian film marketplace to a degree. I mean, the thing is that there are certain platforms and certain ones that really try to target particularly just the Christian audience, and that would be like PureFlix and Hallmark Channel to a degree. I think that's a little bit more of a, I don't want to use the word maybe smarmy, but it's just, it's a very much kind of, inspirational, maybe not even faith specific sometimes, and it's more like Touched by an Angel than it is like, the gospel necessarily. So yeah, I think every platform though is going to have to get good at recognizing that they're serving a variety of different audiences. For instance, Netflix, and this is particular to the US, honestly. I honestly think that other nations have different cultures, and sometimes they're honestly so post-Christian at this point, and that just this element isn't as much at play in other nations. But in the US particularly, look at Netflix and what happened with that film Cuties this year. That's a film that didn't cause a lot of stir in France or in Britain or in Australia, which is a film about kind of underage girls and this dance troupe, etc. But when it hit the U.S., there were several groups and parents advocacy groups, etc., that had concerns about it and said, "Hey, this seems to be kind of sexualizing young girls, etc." And there were a number of people. I mean, there were millions of people that then cut their Netflix subscription and canceled it. And so, and it actually showed up in the quarterly report for Netflix. If you look at it, I mean, they had a dip in the fall, and people were like, "We're still in the middle of the pandemic. Why was Netflix losing subscriptions?" And they could only point to the Cuties film as saying, "Well, in the U.S., it just, there was this uproar, and we didn't really respond to it well." And so every service is going to have to deal with that. Every studio, to a degree, if they're trying to reach families, trying to reach Christian families, they're going to have to do it. I think that, so for instance, it's an interesting move to notice that Sony, major player in a major studio in the marketplace, has been purchased the PureFlix streaming platform and said, we're going to particularly target faith families and, try to reach Christians. I think they actually have a pretty good team there. If, Rich Peluso runs what's called Affirm Films, they're under the Sony banner, and they've created movies like, Paul the Apostle of Christ most recently, but all the Kendrick Brothers movies, War Room, and they really co-produced and distributed those. Some others like Soul Surfer, etc., have come out of Sony. So they have a pretty good basis to start with, and I think that's an effort to watch big time. I think to see if they can actually, compile and collect enough of the faith content from different providers to actually make it, a must-watch destination. The current PureFlix is just pretty, it's pretty low quality. It's not great. I think The Chosen is honestly one of the best things on there. And it's not even their show. So, I think that there will be efforts. I mean, Disney honestly has done some pretty decent stuff this year. They did the film Clouds, which is really good. I don't know if you've gotten to see that. Josh, you haven't yet?
I have not seen that specific one, no.
Yeah, it's quite good. It deals with the Catholic family and kind of their sort of, honestly, like there's some really interesting scenes of prayer. His faith is referred to a lot in that film. It's on Disney Plus. It's quite a good movie. So it's good to see that Disney isn't abandoning necessarily trying to reach the faith market particularly, and realizes that's probably a part of the kind of spectrum of different audiences and segments that they're trying to reach. So, I think it's important that faith, it's kind of like, I don't necessarily always want as a Christian faith to be, have to be kind of driving every scene and driving every moment in a film. I want people to tell great stories and to be able to tell kind of the truth of what they're experiencing, and whether if it's a, political thriller, faith may not come out a whole lot, but, there are contexts where it should, and rather than kind of pushing it to the side and, kind of keeping it out of the public square, which is an increasing trend for sure, including in films and TV shows, I would hope that faith can be, one of those aspects of a story that is still emphasized, that is still discussed, and, not de-emphasized and silenced. So.
That's very interesting. And I hadn't thought about it in terms of what the streaming services do in America versus in other parts of the world. And that is interesting how there is almost kind of this market demand for at least some content in a fiercely competitive market for streaming services, that the market somewhat demands at least some content that, even if it's not an explicitly Christian service like a Netflix or Hulu or whatever, to have programming that's going to appeal to a Christian audience.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's, content is king, as they say in the entertainment world. And, the rights to these programs, even that are older legacy programs, are going to be, I think, fiercely fought over. I mean, I think Netflix has done well, partly by bringing on some older titles that are maybe even 10, 15 years old, like Soul Surfer and others. And so I think Sony is going to take back a lot of their content. And obviously we're seeing that already with Disney in the last, 2-3 years, as they've started Disney Plus. They've taken all that content back from Amazon and Netflix and just put it on their service, which makes, Disney Plus quite a good service, I think, in terms of for families of faith and who care about issues of faith. I mean, there's a number of films like Hunchback of Notre Dame and, Ruby Bridges and different ones that are very strong, I think, in their faith themes, which some people would say, oh, Disney's abandoned faith. They've abandoned all interest in that. I think, Disney is an interesting kind of microcosm, in a sense, of sort of the whole entertainment industry, and how you can't just kind of ignore one segment and, push them off to the side. But you have to realize that, yes, there is demand for it, I think, particularly in America. And it's going to remain that way. And so folks who can actually meet that need and can serve families well, and in kind of telling those stories of faith, stories that don't relegate faith to some back corner, and to, I think they're going to do better in the marketplace ultimately. So.
Yeah, again, I think that's very interesting. And I think there's some great movies that aren't, again, especially religious movies that are really telling the gospel when you look at them. And it might not have been set out by the writers or producers. I think in God's, I think it's somewhat hardwired into us as humans that we love a story of fall and redemption. And so, yeah, I think that's the reason. We might not always know it, but I think some of the movies that we love the most, the reason why we love them is because it's the story of the gospel.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good insight. I think, it is, I think, even the many pastors and many preachers will kind of use this discussion of, well, God is the one who created stories, and he, he's the ultimate storyteller, and we should be good at storytelling. And I think they use that line, but they don't always necessarily put, the work in, or venture beyond necessarily Hallmark Channel, or Little House on the Prairie, or some of their favorites, to think, well, what are stories maybe in genres that you don't care for, that are thrillers, or that are action, or that are even horror. Horror isn't necessarily my genre, but there are, for instance, there's a show on CBS called Evil, that is actually a really interesting religious show. And I got to talk to the husband wife duo who created it. And this is definitely a TV-14 show. I don't think it's for everybody.
Sure.
And my wife really can't watch it. She's just like, hey, this is darker than I can deal with. But it's a fascinating drama where you have an investigator who's very much a cynic, an atheist kind of character, and you have a priest who's involved on this team, and you have one who is more of a I think a Middle Eastern background kind of person who also works to solve mysteries. And so you have this collection of very different characters who are all working to kind of they're essentially hired by various police departments, various government agencies, who say there's some unexplained things here that we don't get, and could you look into this? And so there's an episode on exorcism, and there's one on some of these spiritual issues that are very intriguing. And so the husband wife duo who created it, one of them is Catholic, and the husband is Catholic, and the wife is an atheist, who has Jewish background. And so they've always, throughout their decades of marriage, have had these conversations about, well, can crime be explained simply by sort of one's nature or nurture, or are there spiritual elements at play? Are there some darker things at play sometimes? And when you look at crime and you look at serial killers and some of these things, like isn't possession a real thing? And they explore this in a really interesting and well scripted show that I think it raises more questions than it answers. It doesn't leave you with some kind of neat little bow on it and say, and it's almost like Lost, the show. If you ever watched that, it's Lost was so much about kind of that science versus faith kind of struggle. And at the end of it, there wasn't some simple, oh, it's all science, it's all faith. There wasn't a simple answer to it, but it is in those kind of questions and in the complexities of those debates where I think perhaps Christians, we would learn to voice our beliefs better. We'd learn kind of that the difficulties that people face, and learn to have more empathy and understanding for their viewpoint, and not just kind of use the Bible as kind of a bludgeon of some kind and say, well, ye must be saved. That's going to be the answer to all your problems. Well, we know that the Bible tells us that we're still going to have problems as believers, and our experience in life, I'm sure stories would evidence that as well. So there's, I think, the things that we love about good storytelling, absolutely, I think, can stem from and be representative of and reflected in the gospel, for sure.
Yeah, I think so. And again, I think a lot of our popular films that are so powerful in telling that message perhaps do it in a more real way than sort of sometimes than specifically Christian films or movies, which this is a broad brushstroke, but I think can sometimes be a little bit too sanitized in its depiction of the world, or making Christian characters in a movie sometimes seem unrealistically pious or faithful. And no, we're not perfect. We still struggle. We still personally are sinful people. And so sometimes I think that there can be kind of a truer depiction of how the world actually is in a film or a TV show that's not branding itself above all as being a Christian content.
Yeah, I agree with you for sure. And I think, for instance, one of the worst aspects of that is atheist characters sometimes in Christian written films. They're just, they have no redeeming qualities. They're, they are just, and then ultimately probably they're killed off, which is what we see, for instance, in the God's Not Dead films. I mean, the first one particularly is pretty egregious on that front, where the atheist character like dies in the street in a really awful way. But there is a Netflix film at the same time that I could see as a counter to this, and that is The Case for Christ. And this is why, by the way, I think people need to start to know directors and start to know kind of more than just sort of a brand, because that was written by Brian Bird, who's a very talented writer, and who also writes for When Calls the Heart on Hallmark, and has been doing this for decades. But he, in telling the story of Lee Strobel, who's a former journalist and an atheist, he really, helps you understand, see, and see this man as the protagonist and somebody that you're rooting for, who's an atheist character. He begins that way and is, skeptical of evidence, skeptical of Christian claims throughout. And slowly, as he investigates such claims, he becomes more of a believer. And obviously now he's a leading apologist for the gospel. But it's a compelling film. It's a film that looks at hard questions. It's not a movie that's afraid of, for even his, he himself, who's this Christian author, he's portrayed as, an alcoholic at times, as abusive at times. I mean, it's definitely not a pretty picture sometimes of his past journey. And in speaking to him, he was like, yeah, hey, if anything, that was more sanitized than it could have been. But I appreciate that they actually went there with some of the difficult aspects of my journey, and not just kind of trying to tell it in some pretty way. And his wife, even, she struggles in the film. She's certainly a committed believer, but is considering leaving him, and because he's just not there for their daughter, etc. So it's good to see when you can move beyond stereotypes. We're all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, for certain. And so we're all sinful. We all have blind spots. We all have issues where we're gonna not see the full picture. And so I think that a film like that, and others in even the more mainstream, can give us insight, give us more empathy, give us understanding of of our condition, and how we can be a light to others around us.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And it's funny that you mentioned God's Not Dead, because that's one of the examples I think of, where the lady gets diagnosed with cancer and she's at the hospital by herself. And it's like, atheists don't even have friends in the world of that movie, or people that care about them. Meanwhile, the Christian characters are quoting whole sections of scripture just off the top of their heads. And again, at a certain point, it's propaganda as opposed to really great storytelling.
Yeah, it's, and there are sometimes, I think, generational differences. I think that, there are people who do like comfort food, and so I can understand the popularity of Hallmark, that there are people who just want a simple story that's going to get wrapped up in 40 minutes, and that's, it's obviously the Christmas type stories that we're seeing. And I know that this is probably airing after that point, but, it's just wall to wall, kind of the same sort of cheesy romance, that they're telling on that. And so, I understand, especially, families with kids in the household. I understand that. I've got a 1-year-old and we've got another one on the way. And, there's an aspect of when you're a parent, you certainly see the world a little differently, and you begin to look at it through their eyes, and like, oh, wow, it's okay. When there's even peril on screen, when there is, just characters in danger, it gets him unsettled. And so that's through the eyes of a 1-year-old. That's why there are shows for toddlers and there are shows for little kids. And, you do want to be age appropriate with kids shows. But yeah, when we're, when I became a man, I put away childish things, to quote the word. And so I would hope that we would not necessarily have to be coddled that way, as people who can navigate a little bit other waters of culture. And so, we have to get better. I think sometimes that we put ourselves in familiar genres, in stuff. For instance, I know people who are, who would be concerned about Lord of the Rings, who would be concerned about, even Narnia and fantasy literature like that has wizards and has aspects of magic and witchcraft, etc. And being able to navigate that well and understand, that genre, and know that it's not like, breaking biblical rules to understand and appreciate and know that, hey, there's committed Christians who wrote this, Tolkien and Lewis, and what were they doing in these stories. So, I think we have to get past the sort of simple understanding of story and try to elevate that. And and understand that, you're going to be challenged sometimes. There's going to be uncomfortable themes sometimes, and difficult emotions and experiences that are far different than our own, that we're going to be encountering. I hope that what we do partly in film is to try to understand, I think that these issues, for instance, of race and of racial justice are a very big deal. And I think that we as Christians shouldn't, relegate that to some, kind of lower tier of understanding. These are issues of human dignity, about seeing the image of God in every person and realizing that that image of God has been marred and, has not always been seen clearly because of some cultural things, because of decades and centuries of history. And so the stories of people, whether it's a film like 42 and the story of Jackie Robinson, whether it's, even a fantasy story like Black Panther, where, you're understanding a little bit more about, what they're trying to say with this story of an idealized society, where, culture is seen in a very prominent way and is able to be elevated. That's, and then that's not reflecting in our world here in the US. So, I think there's a lot to be said about, kind of trying to see life through another person's eyes. And that's very much what film and TV hopefully is going to be doing for us if we're venturing beyond, just kind of comfort food stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate it. The last thing I'd like to ask you about is, because I know you in your writing, you talk about films or documentaries that are more specifically faith-based or Christian, but you also talk about ones that are meant for more of a general audience. So I'd be curious, just in different genres, some films that you would recommend that might be a little bit under the radar. Maybe they're not the huge blockbuster films, in different genres that have wholesome faith-based values, even if that again wasn't perhaps the entire basis of making the film. So I'd be curious, like, are there any comedies that you'd recommend?
Oh man, that's a great question. I think comedy is one of the harder genres to write for sure. I'm fortunate in that I think some of my views on entertainment and culture have been shaped by partly my time with Focus on the Family and working and getting to know the writers of Adventures in Odyssey, who do such a great job on their work. And so I think with comedy, it partly deals with the star. I'm always looking for a good comedy, frankly, genre. I think that, it is probably the hardest to write for. So I've, appreciated that more so. I think a few ones that probably a little bit more on the family friendly side, but ones that I folks should check out. One would be Instant Family, which is a story about a foster to adopt situation where this family takes on 3 kids and ultimately adopts them. Really funny movie. It had a lot of research put into it, frankly, from people who are foster care experts. And, even though that situation, honestly, of foster to adopt is a little bit rare. And so, there are some people would say, oh, well, that's not all that common. It's just a very funny movie. It's from Sean Anders, who is the director of like the Daddy's Home movies 1 and 2. And he himself, had a foster care situation in his family. And so it's very kind of based on his own family's sort of story and mishaps and et cetera along the way. But you see some kind of aspects of kind of navigating cultural issues that are different from the kids versus the parents, and just really some fascinating stuff in that. It's a fun family film. I think it's probably PG-13, maybe because of some of the language, et cetera, and a few of the situations, but it is a great movie. I would definitely recommend Instant Family. I think right now it's on Amazon. It's been on Netflix in the past, but I would definitely recommend that for folks. If people have not checked out Psych, which is a show that ran for 8 or 9 years. Really fun show. It's entirely free on Peacock, which is the NBC Universal streaming service. And, it's amazing how many thousands of hours of content, frankly, they put on that service for free. There's maybe a few ads here and there, but, Psych is a great show. He, the lead guy in it, Sean, is, pretending to be a psychic. But he's not really. He just has a great kind of sense of detection and, can kind of see details like a Sherlock Holmes type character. But he plays it off as if he's a psychic. And so he has, this African-American guy who's kind of his partner in crime in that sort of detective business. And they solve various murder mysteries and other types of, crimes, et cetera, in the Santa Barbara area. But went for so long because it just has such a great cast. Corbin Burnson is also in that, who is a man who's been featured at national religious broadcasters and is a father figure in that film, and is just a great kind of offers that fatherly presence and direction in that show. But really, it just almost feels like a throwback kind of show to like the days of Boy Meets World or something, in how clean it is, and just that there's a lot to enjoy about. It honestly, the pilot is one of the has some of the more edgier scenes in it, so I would encourage people to get past the pilot. It's kind of like 24 in that regard, where the pilot in I think seasons 1 and 2 of that show are have some more violence and issues than the rest of the show does. So it's kind of intriguing that way. The last thing on comedy I would say is the Muppets. I love the Muppets. I think so if people haven't watched, for instance, the 2011 film with Jason Segel and Amy Adams, such a fun film, and I kind of a nostalgia trip. I think they did a great job of balancing sort of the innocence and also the edginess of the Muppets, and what Jim Henson did with that show. And there's certainly a very ongoing effort among fans to try to get Disney to release more of the Muppet content, because a lot of it is still kind of in their vault. So hopefully we'll see more of that as well. I'm also, by the way, introducing my wife right now to Seinfeld, a little bit of that. I mentioned earlier working with the Adventures in Odyssey writers, and they were all fans of Seinfeld, and it's a great comedy show. It's sharp writing. If you don't know that, it's kind of definitely a very, one of TV's kind of great sitcoms. And so, if people, it's on Hulu right now, and I think it's going to stay there for a little bit, but definitely worth checking out.
What about in the drama genre?
Drama is definitely my wheelhouse for sure. I really love, biopics particularly. So real life dramas, stuff that is based on real life and stays there. So goodness, I could go for a long time about, but I could definitely say a few things about the stuff in the Disney world, which is, we mentioned already Clouds. Clouds is a great film, one that people should see. It really has some great stuff in it, and is beyond, I think there's been this little subgenre of kind of sick kids, giving their kind of dying wish, and these are common on like Lifetime or Hallmark, etc. But there's an aspect of this going a little bit deeper, and having some deeper themes in it. So I would encourage people to check it out. I think it deals with grief, deals with loss in a very real way, and not in just kind of a surface level kind of way. Really quite a moving film. Another recent one that a lot of people missed is a film called Togo, which was released on Disney Plus. It is the story, you might know something of the story from the movie Balto, because it does deal with kind of the Iditarod, Alaska dog sled race that happened at the turn of the century. And essentially, there was an outbreak of a disease, and someone needed to get the vaccine and across the mountains. And so people always think it's Balto was the actual dog, but the actual dog was Togo, who led most of that way. I think Balto only did like the last mile of that, dozens of mile run. But the great actor Willem Dafoe, who a lot of people might know more as the Green Goblin from the Spider-Man, trilogy with Tobey Maguire, but he is the lead in that, and it's just a beautiful film. In that even though it's a simple movie, and I wasn't sure I was going to like it. It actually deals, so much of the story is told in flashback, where he goes back and kind of reveals moments from his early life with his wife, and it's almost sort of a marriage movie, really, is what's interesting about it. His wife has such a prominent role in the backstory, and you just see them encouraging each other and sharpening each other and working together as a team, he and his wife. And there is this aspect of endurance, of course, having to deal with the elements and having to deal with this situation where he's at the end of his rope. He's, in a situation where death is at his doorstep in various points of this journey. But I think he's such a great actor, Willem Dafoe. He just carries the whole movie. So definitely worth checking out. One that I would hope people would really seek out and watch with their family. It's a great one to see. The last I would highlight in drama, because I could talk many other ones, but the film Harriet that came out last year, which is the story of Harriet Tubman, who obviously saved and rescued. She herself was an enslaved, African American in Maryland, and was able to escape to freedom. And then she went back and ventured back to her hometown and to several other area cities where she rescued other enslaved people. And it's a fascinating picture, and she is such a woman of faith as well. So Harriet Tubman, I mean, the film is just fascinating because it portrays very accurately and very correctly to her journals the fact that she said, well, I prayed and I sought God in these moments of being hearing dogs and hearing the slave catchers' dogs, and knowing that I was surrounded, and that, you know, I prayed to the Lord, and He said, go across this creek, and that it's shallow enough in this one place to go across. And I did it. And the movie literally portrays that, her leading a group of, you know, 10, 12 people across this creek, you know, and just this narrow little channel within it that's deep on either side. And she only knew that, she says, because of prayer. And, you know, I asked the director about this, who herself is an African-American woman named Cassie Lemons, you know, and is known, you know, in the Academy Awards circles, and is a very prominent director, and just said, you know, this is really interesting, you know, you showing her Christian faith like this, you know, why did you make that choice? And she said, well, I just looked at enough source documents, and I just took her word for it. You know, I know some people say that maybe she, you know, had an injury to her head that caused her to have these visions and caused her to see these things. But she said, I just think that I just had to take her word for it and say she was hearing from God. And, you know, then we showed these scenes. And so it's really one of the strongest faith-based movies that's come out in some time. By totally, you know, I think that there was some people of faith behind it, but you know, it's a mainstream movie. There's not necessarily any Christian or faith-based filmmaking team that was behind it, but really gives you such insights, I think, into these issues of, you know, racial justice, and, you know, helping you understand that there's such a deep and difficult history here that stretches back a long ways, and that there are aspects that continue, I think, to affect our society. But to be able to elevate a hero like that, and somebody who hasn't, you know, gotten, I don't think, quite the prominence, and you know, never had a big budget movie like this told about her life. That's a movie, Harriet, that is, it's Bifocus Features, so that's a Universal company. It might show up on Peacock in the future, I would imagine, maybe especially during, you know, Black History Month in February. I would imagine it might show up on one of the services. So I would be watching out for that. Do it, and do a deep study on it. I mean, there are fascinating books about her, and you know, so there's so much we can learn, I think, from drama, and especially from that these biopics, and you know, people who really dig into the history and try to accurately tell a story. I think there's a lot to learn there.
Josh, thank you so much for taking the time to. There's so many other things I feel like I could ask you about. I appreciate your insights and all this. I sincerely appreciate your time and you joining me. And just thank you so much.
My great pleasure, Josh. Let's do it again sometimes for sure. As this ramps up more, I'll be watching hopefully other episodes and tuning in. I think, hey, we got to realize the power of story, and the power of film is significant, and these are things we should be aware of, watching, and not necessarily keeping ourselves in some little small understanding, but hopefully broadening our understanding of what's going on in the wider culture and in the wider world. So, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.